right, good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's great to see you all here. So we have a very special lecture tonight. We have Dr. Marie Price from George Washington University, where she teaches in international affairs and in geography. And as you can see, we're going to have a talk entitled Global Washington. So I'm going to keep our introduction short, so we have plenty of time to hear from our speaker. And welcome.
So it's wonderful to be here. I've had a chance to meet some of you and talk to the classes. I know I'm in Richmond and have the audacity to talk about global Washington, but I think some of the themes and ideas that I'll share with you in my research in Washington will resonate with some of your experiences here. So I want to begin with a short quote. It's actually by a political scientist, Robert Putnam. And he writes, "The central challenge for modern diversified societies is to create a new, broader sense of we." So tonight's talk is my geographical exploration of the new we have become in a globalized Washington. And to get straight to the meat of the matter, this is a metropolitan area that has seen tremendous change, demographic change. In a relatively short time, from a city that had very few foreign-born in 1970, just 4% foreign-born, well below the national average, to by 1990 being almost 12%, to 2000, 17%, and the 2010, more or less, using ACS data, almost 22%. Okay. So you go from an area that was maybe 1 in 12, 1 in 16 foreign-born to 1 in 5. And not only is it grown very quickly, it's been classified by my colleague Audrey Singer at the Brookings Institute as a new immigrant gateway, and went from new immigrant gateway to really an established one in really just a couple of decades. And not only has it grown and diversified, it is up there with some of the big boys in immigration, big gals, I don't know, however you think of cities, female, masculine, or feminine. I mean, New York City is still the dominant metropolitan area in terms of foreign-born. Then Los Angeles, and it shows the percent foreign-born. Miami, Chicago, these are places we've been writing about for a long time as important immigrant destinations, but Washington is number 7. And because it's a newer destination, I think slightly different pattern of settlement, integration, inclusion, and certainly a very different mix. But also because of the sudden changes, I think there's also been some challenges. As a big metropolitan area with a lot of different jurisdictions, there's the state of Virginia, there's the state of Maryland, there's the District of Columbia, have all taken different strategies on how to deal with this diversity. So I'm a geographer. I think in maps. I find them very persuasive, and especially for immigration work, trying to graphically demonstrate some of this. So this is how I think of global Washington. Arrows flowing in, many different source regions, certainly very significant flows from South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Latin America, but also Africa, and even Europe. Another way is the pie chart. And again, one of the distinguishing features of this region is there's no dominant group. Often in the U.S. immigration metropolitan story, the dominant immigrant group is from what country? Mexico, right? It's the largest source of foreign-born people, the largest source of legal immigrants, and also the largest source of undocumented. And in most cities, if you look at what's the largest immigrant, it's going to be Mexico. Not so for Washington. The largest group is El Salvador. And then India and China are pretty close. They kind of go back and forth. Then you have Korea, the Philippines, and Mexico's pretty far down the list. The other thing is, you look at this list, it's almost region of the world is represented. And so that makes for interesting challenges. I know school districts, both Fairfax County and Montgomery County, they actually hire interpreter services. For example, yes, you'll have people on the staff that speak Spanish. Yes, you'll have people on the staff that speak French. But how many know Mongolian? Not so many. But there was this surge of Mongolian immigrants, and I remember being at my son's PTA meeting, and they had simultaneous translation in Spanish and Mongolian, and we're like all scratching our heads. What? Mongolian? But they were Mongolians. Small group, but in one particular school, they really settled there. So how do you deal with that diversity? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? So again, I'm going to just give you a few slides showing these major groups and where they come from. From Latin America, you have, this is the regional breakdown. I see two slides at once, I had to figure out where I was. So you have, of the foreign-born, 40% are from Latin America. And then in the Latin American pie, El Salvador is the biggest one. And Central America is rather significant, but so are some Andean countries, Peru and Bolivia. Why El Salvador? So again, I said Washington is a relatively newer immigrant destination. As immigrants were starting to come into Washington, especially in the 1980s, there was a civil war in El Salvador. And interestingly, there have been a couple of ethnographic works saying, why did the Salvadorans come here? And there were a couple of critical organizations, say World Bank and even USAID staff that brought in domestics from El Salvador as housekeepers, and then they brought in family members. In a situation of conflict, you tend to have more and more people coming, and eventually Salvadorans not given refugee status, but were given temporary protected status, which allowed them to stay, not to go back and forth, but allowed them to stay without fear of deportation. And then, when they first arrived in the Washington area, there weren't a lot of other immigrant groups that they were necessarily competing with, so they prospered to some level, and then eventually other groups started to come. But it's the only city, there's more El Salvadorans in Los Angeles, but this is the only metropolitan area where there's the largest immigrant group. A little bit later, I'm going to talk about a particular group from Latin America, and that is Bolivians. From Asia, it's also a very diverse picture. You see India, China, and Korea all being really substantial. The Korean flow begins with a very old flow after the Korean War. There's an often relationship between countries that we have go to war with, and then later refugees resettle here. So in the case of the Koreans, Vietnamese, etc. The other important part of the Asian stream is some very high-skilled, high-tech workers. And people coming in with H-1B visas, and that explains a lot of the growth of the South Asian Indian population. And then we also have Iranians. It's not their biggest destination. Most Iranians, the most popular destination for Iran is Los Angeles, and Iranians call it Tehrangeles. If you're Iranian, you know about. But there's an old flow there, and some of it is refugees. So the Washington story is economic migrants for sure, but there's also some significant refugee flows that contribute to the mix. And then from Africa, the largest group by far is Ethiopia. And again, some Ethiopians came as economic migrants, and others came as refugees. Then Ghana and Nigeria have mostly been economic migrants. One of the interesting things about the African immigrants, they often have extremely high levels of education. Some of the most groups come in with college degrees and also graduate degrees. And in fact, another really significant characteristic of immigrants to Washington is generally fairly high levels of education. The city does get low-skilled immigrants with less formal education, but they also get many high-skilled workers. That's sort of the big regional picture. In a few minutes, I'm going to focus on three groups, looking at Bolivians from Latin America, looking at Ethiopians from Africa, and South Asian Indians from India as examples of different ways in which groups integrate into this metropolitan area that is hyper-diverse. Oops, did I do that wrong? There we go. So this is a comparison here between the foreign-born immigrants, that's pretty much a synonymous term, and the native-born, meaning people that were born within the territorial state of the United States. Didn't necessarily are native-born of metropolitan Washington. And Washington is a really affluent and well-educated area overall. Okay, that's not necessarily news to you, although it's not always, there's obviously variation. And so in this just simple comparison, there's a map here. There it is. So there's the District of Columbia right there, and this is Arlington. I should really label that map, sorry about that. But one of the important settlement aspects is that if you look at the District of Columbia, there are some immigrants, but not that many. It's very suburban. And the major destinations are Montgomery County and Fairfax County. Arlington and Alexandria definitely have foreign-born. You can see them sort of colored in here. But also some of the counties further out are definitely Loudoun County, Prince William County. So what can we say about the foreign-born? These are just ACS data. I was showing class earlier today how do you extract this. So on average, the foreign-born are a little bit older than the native-born. Why is that? Why would the, well, yes?
They lived in their country, in their home country for several years, and then when they moved to America, they've already had years on the native born.
Right, and so you kind of get a wedge of people coming in their 20s and 30s, and maybe they don't have children with them, or so. Whereas the native-born population, you get that full spread. Some places it isn't true, but in the case of metropolitan Washington, the foreign-born are a little bit older. They tend actually a little more likely to be married. Their family sizes are a little bit larger, but not by much. Bachelor's degrees, comparable, but a little less than the native-born. And for master's degrees, a little less than the native-born. Although these figures are quite high in general, especially for master's degrees, Washington has a lot of really well-educated people with a lot of advanced degrees in the metropolitan area. The median household income isn't bad, well above the national average, which is more around $50,000, but not as high as the native-born, so there suggests a gap. Although oftentimes I've given these talks in especially in places like Bolivia or Latin America, and I think, holy mother, I want to go to Washington. I can have an income like that, but it's not quite so simple. It's not automatic. The other thing is, even the foreign-born have pretty high levels of home ownership, which is, some people find that unexpected. Speak a language other than English. There's where you see a really big difference. Just the diversity. And then the speak English less than very well. There's some people, obviously the majority of the foreign-born claim to speak English better, at least at the medium level, but there's still a significant group that doesn't speak English very well, or maybe not at all. So these are the aggregate statistics looking at native-born, foreign-born, and but it hides as much as it reveals. Right? It suggests that there are differences, but what I'm going to do now is look at three different groups and see how they compare and where they settle and some of the challenges they face. Oops. So again, this is two more maps. You saw that graph of the growth of the foreign-born. This was another study I did with Audrey Singer, who's a residents call it the Brookings Institute. And we were interested here in the outer suburbs. So we actually considered the District of Columbia, Arlington and Alexandria, the urban core. And then we mapped by zip code where the foreign-born were. And in 1980, there was just one place right near Route 7 in the Colmer that had more than 20% foreign-born. Most places were actually less than 10% foreign-born. And then these areas in red are some places that I'm going to mention, like Wheaton, Silver Spring in Maryland, Annandale in Virginia, and I think I might briefly mention Herndon. These are areas we did more detailed study of. And then 20 years later, look how many more districts are at least 20 or not 30% foreign-born. So why this map was useful is that there is a kind of traditional narrative that immigrants are supposed to go into the urban core, maybe congregate in poorer housing areas, and then they move out to the suburbs, and that's a sign of assimilation, spatial assimilation, right? But what happens if you begin the process in the suburbs, and especially some of the outer? Does that improve your chances of integrating, assimilating to society, or does it weaken your chances? And then also, how do we think about, there's again a real tradition in the immigration literature, and geographers as much as other social scientists are drawn to those enclaves, places of concentration, where you can say, oh, this is where the Salvadoran community is, or this is where the Ethiopian community is. But what happens when they're really dispersed? How is a sense of community maintained, or is it maintained? Some of those issues we addressed earlier today in the lecture, and I might return to some of them, but I think there are important things to think about in this highly suburbanized experience. So one of the terms I mentioned today is heterolocalism. And it's a word that was created by a geographer and a sociologist with sociological geographic imagination, Wilbur Zielinski and Barrett Lee. And what they saw in some case studies they did in cities, but especially Washington, was this sense of heterolocal means having a community without propinquity, meaning living near each other. So maybe there is such a thing as a Guatemalan community in Washington, but they might not really living in the same residential area. It's too hard to do. The housing markets are too expensive, so people are scattered. So how do you build that sense of community? Maybe there's a couple of critical restaurants that people go to. Maybe you form a soccer league, and it's the Guatemalan League, and all the guys know on Saturday you go to this park and you'll see all your friends. You know, that park might be a 20-mile drive or a 30-mile drive. Maybe it's a place of worship, and you know you can get together. And so there are all sorts of ways that these really dynamic communities have formed where people maintain a sense of identity, but it isn't sort of neatly mappable. You know, it isn't always so obvious in the landscape. A place like Wheaton, which we call one of the most hyper-diverse areas in the metropolitan area, in the 1990s, we were able to get access to INS data. We found people from 132 countries settled in Wheaton in the 1990s. You know? So, and then when you asked public officials, how do you deal with this? Because that's actually the place where, as they say, the rubber hits the road. When you've got a lot of diverse people, it's usually school districts, fire departments, police departments, you know, provisions. Those are the people that realize, oh my gosh, who speaks, you know, fill in the blank, some language, or who can explain why this group worships this way, or why this food preparation, can we allow it? You know, all sorts of interesting things. But in Wheaton, the community, the local government was part of Fairfax County, but they have the jurisdictions are broken into divisions. They launched this campaign, come to Wheaton. It's deliciously habit-forming. And what was deliciously habit-forming was there were all these ethnic restaurants. So you could eat Filipino food, you could go have Moby Dick sushi. That sounds terrifying, Moby Dick sushi. You know, why would you, these portions must be large, who knows? Panaderia, Guatemala, you know, fashion. This is actually a day labor center that looks kind of nondescript, serving a lot of documented day laborers. In that sense, that kind of intense diversity, they were trying to market it as a feature, an attractive place to visit, to go out for an evening and probably have an easier time parking than if you went to downtown Washington. Oops. That's quite the end of this. In Annandale, which is in Northern Virginia, Fairfax County, that's a community that does have a pretty substantial Korean community. Koreans, depending on what ACS data or census tract data you look at, they are often the largest immigrant group, but not always. Sometimes Vietnamese are there, and there's Bolivians, so there's a few groups. But they actually have a more physical presence. So, you know, a place called Seoul Plaza is certainly a nod to Koreans. Churches, and actually some of the commercial parks or professional facilities, dentists, travel agencies, you'll actually see, you might not be able to see in that picture, but there's actually the signs are in Korean. In fact, there's definitely been Korean investors that have come from Seoul that have tried to sort of build up the commercial presence there. So there's some very interesting transnational linkages to Annandale. And if you look at the map where we mapped where Koreans were in metropolitan DC, you'll see definitely Annandale is an area of some concentration, but there are also Koreans all over the metropolitan area. And certainly but they tend to much more be in the outer suburbs. So they're a group that tends to go farther out rather than close in. They may have businesses in the inner core. Koreans in particular are very strong control of dry cleaning and also some small grocers in the Washington metropolitan area. So this, in a way, presents itself as more like the ethnic economy that people write about, although it's much more suburban. It's transnational in some ways, but even Annandale has a really diverse mix of foreign-born. And there's some neighborhoods where the foreign-born are more than half of the population, although they're not all Korean. So this is how one way I envision metropolitan Washington. And you have the District of Columbia and the inner core. I've used those terms before. The inner suburbs, Fairfax, Montgomery, and Prince George's, those are all very large counties with over 1 million people. And then you have the outer counties, Caldwell, Charles, Prince William, Loudoun, and Frederick, outer suburbs, which have seen very, very rapid rise in foreign-born. And then, you have the far suburbs, but they're actually seeing rises. And I'm going to break this down because I'm going to show you a chart in just a minute. Hold on. There we go. This is not it's actually a table, not very exciting. But this is comparing the foreign-born in 2000 with the foreign-born in 2011-13. And as a side note, I told classes this earlier, one of the interesting decisions the U.S. Census made in the 2010 census is that they did not ask a foreign-born question. And actually, for people like me who really like working with the census data, it's very unfortunate. So how do we get information about the foreign-born? We have to use these yearly surveys called the American Community Survey, that they aggregate the data over 3 years. So that's why we have the 2011-2013 aggregation. And then from that, they estimate what the population size is. And the reason why the census stopped asking the foreign-born question, they decided to just have one short form with very few questions every 10 years, and that is a sense to count the populations in a district. That's the obligation of the census. It's in the Constitution they have to do that. But then all the other information comes out from these American community surveys, and they have all kinds of information, language. And there's some really good things about the freshness, the renewing of the data, but there's also areas where you have some trouble comparing. Anyhow, what I want to show here is you look at the inner core, and the overall story for Washington from 2000 to 2013 was pretty high growth in the foreign born. It doubled. It increased 50%. So that's that top line. But if you look at the inner core, you don't have a 50% growth rate. It's growing more like 25%. And actually, Arlington declined. When you get to that next area, the inner suburbs, you have growth rates closer to the average, with Fairfax County a little below, Prince George's a little higher. Fairfax City is kind of an anomaly, it's a very small jurisdiction. But then look at the outer suburbs. You have incredible growth rates, right? 200%, 300%. So what that means is a place like Prince William County in 2000 went from having 30,000 foreign born to 92,000, right? Or you see Loudoun County growth. And why that becomes interesting politically is that in those counties there were a lot of very strong reactions to that demographic change, right? And it was a change that happened pretty suddenly. Now, who made up that increase? It could be Asian, and it was Asian, Latino, some African. It was a mix, but especially the Latino population in Prince William County grew very dramatically. So how did that play out locally? One strategy is that certain counties decided to partner with the Department of Homeland Security and sign 287G agreements. And these are agreements where you deputize local police to have the ability to act as immigration officials. And they could question people, ask them to show their identification to prove they're a citizen. And if they couldn't prove them, to detain them until they could and deport them. How do you prove you're a citizen? If I can prove to me that you're American right now, how would you do it? Okay, you have a passport with you right now? You'd have to go home to get it. Yeah. But you live close by, so you can do it pretty quickly, you know? I mean, you don't necessarily walk around with your passport all the time. You probably shouldn't walk around with your passport. The driver's license is a proof. Who gets questioned to prove your identity? Yes.
Those who often look or profile to be from immigrant countries, common immigration countries.
Right, so
Hispanics, Latinos.
if you don't speak a language, you speak a language with an accent. How do you know who doesn't belong? It's actually also hard if you have to actually prove you're undocumented. That's not so easy to do either. But what happened in Prince William is in 2006 and 7, they instituted this 287G, and there was this crackdown. There were raids at some workplaces. You know, the story, a worker goes off and their tail light is broken and they get pulled over and detained. And this obviously sparked a lot of terror and a lot of controversy. The long-term residents of the county said, look at our county's changing. These aren't people that belong here. There are undocumented here. But then there was a lot of pushback saying, wait a minute, you know, is this really the way we should proceed? Almost all of the outer counties in Maryland and Virginia considered adopting 287G. Two of them did, and then even Herndon in Fairfax County adopted it just for its city as a way of pushing back. And sometimes it worked. And in fact, some school data showed that the numbers of Hispanics in schools declined. People left. It also coincided later with the housing market crash in 2008. And then actually there was a real depression in the housing market in Prince William that took much longer to recover. So this is a pretty powerful example, I think, of local jurisdictions having adopting policies that are more oriented towards exclusion and policing and figuring out who should be here and who should be not there. And it definitely brought a chill to many immigrants. And not just Hispanics, this is a Hispanic, Washington Hispanic. So Prince William with Tierra Prohibida, you get it, you're not supposed to be there, you know what that means for removals. The removal story doesn't affect many people, but it affects Latinos dramatically. I've done a lot of work going through the data from Department of Homeland Security. 1 in 3 Latinos know someone who's been removed. And this isn't just people turned away at the border. These are people that have been physically removed from the interior. They've been there. And other people get removed, but Latinos. 90% of removals are male. And from 2000 to 2013, the last year the data was published, 4.2 million people were removed. So we have the ability to remove people. It's very expensive, billions of dollars. We're at a pace of over 400,000 a year. Some are criminal removals, and if you are convicted of a serious crime, even if you're a legal permanent resident, you can be removed. But the vast majority are non-criminal, which means your crime is you're here without authorization, which is technically a crime. So this is a story that really resonates, especially with Latinos. They know this. A lot of other people, blissfully go on, but can you imagine the terror of coming home from school someday and dad's not there, and you don't know where he is, and eventually you find out months later he's back in Peru, and that happens quite a bit. So let me talk to you about 3 different groups and some of the research I've done with my colleague Elizabeth Chaco, and I've got long-standing work with the Bolivian community, and I've actually done work in Bolivia too. This is all about the Washington story. So Bolivians, so I pulled out the ethnicity data from the American Community Survey. Most people that call themselves Bolivian are foreign-born, 71%. You can see their income, pretty high levels of degrees, though not as high, obviously, as the native-born. Medium household income is solid, and very high levels of self-employment. And this, from focus groups and surveys, Bolivians would tell us, in Bolivia we're really not known so much for entrepreneurship, but we have to be here because, I'm fill in the blank. I'm an architect, but I can't get my degree recognized, so I'm working in putting up drywall. Or I'm a doctor, and I'm working as a physician's assistant. And so you have blocked mobility. People that have the human capital, but since their degrees aren't recognized, or maybe there's language problems, they don't speak English as fluently as they need to, they can't quite pursue their trained profession. So they take on the lower one, or they create something like one of my favorite restaurants in Arlington is called Pike's Pizza. And woe be the fool who walks into Pike's Pizza and asks for pizza. They don't sell it ever. But they do have pizza boxes. And you're like, okay, so what goes in the pizza boxes? Is anyone from Bolivia? Salteñas. They're these meaty empanadas. They're thick. And so you go into Pike's Pizza, and you can leave with a pizza box full of empanadas and a few other Bolivian delicacies. I'm sure they had many confused people. So the owner of this didn't ever cook food in Bolivia, but he figured, well, I can make this. And of course it serves the ethnic economy and the ethnic community. People know this is the place where you go for salteñas. Oops, I'm having trouble with my clicker. Ethiopians are another really important group in Washington. They have some very interesting profiles. Both Bolivia and Ethiopia, this is their top destination, and because it's known as a place where Bolivians and Ethiopians are, tends to draw in others who maybe settled in other parts of the country and decide to live here. From the map, again, Ethiopians as well are much more suburban, but they're really kind of in from the end, from certain parts of Montgomery County and Fairfax. So they're really concentrated. And they tend to be concentrated in areas where there are lots of other immigrants. So they live in very, very diverse neighborhoods. One of the interesting things about Ethiopians too, they have had to be a lot more self-employment, created their own jobs. We've experienced that block mobility as well. They really dominate the taxi and limousine services. That's a niche. There's restaurants, and in fact, there's a strip of restaurants right off of U Street in Washington that is a row of all Ethiopian restaurants, and is known not just to Ethiopians, but other people who want to go there. And they also have pretty high levels of education, comparable to the native-born population nationally, not necessarily Washington. They have very strong social organizations from religious groups, and every year there's this huge Ethiopian conference where Ethiopians all over the U.S. gather in Washington, and usually they rent a huge hall. People talk about the homeland, politics, but they also set up networks where they transfer funds back to their communities in Ethiopia. And so what often happens with the ethnic and immigrant economy, it's not just serving the needs of wherever they're settled, but they're also thinking too, how do we help our families and friends in our countries of origin? And so some very interesting transnational networks exist. Ethiopia is one of the countries in Africa that actually has a ministry for the Ethiopians abroad and actively courts diasporas and investment. And so Ethiopian officials will actually come to this conference to see what's going on. And then the last group, I'm just beginning a more in-depth study on entrepreneurship of Asian Indians. And this is a group that has just taken off in the last 15 years in the Washington area. As you can see here, people that call themselves Asian Indian, 71% are foreign-born, more arrived after 2000. In fact, there was a real surge of Asian Indians in the late 1990s and after 2000. They're very high educated. 46% have graduated professional degrees. So this is a very highly skilled group. And they also have much higher median incomes and home ownership. So if you were going to kind of look at these groups at the most crudest level of socioeconomic assimilation, you'd say, wow, this group is really assimilated. They're working in professions. They're much less likely to be self-employed, so they're maybe not experiencing the same block mobility. They're plugged into especially science and business jobs, high income. As you can see on the map, they're totally suburban and almost more of the outer suburbs. They're a very large South Asian community in Loudoun, and they've been generally seen as a very successful immigrant, although recently there have been reports of anti-Indian slurs written on bus stops and stuff. But for the most part, they've done really well. And then one example of a South Asian Indian immigrant who's trying to not just be perceived as an immigrant, but also more engaged politically, Anesh Chopra, who actually ran for lieutenant governor in Virginia. Did he win? No, he did not. But it's showing a degree of political engagement. I mean, he was running for the primary. He didn't get through the primary process. So what I've found in terms of entrepreneurship, so the South Asian Indians are coming with really high social capital, but they also are very well organized. And so that there are these networks, they have meetings, they assist others, especially in biotechnology and the whole communication sector. And they have been very successful in starting businesses. Again, their geographical presence, most people are shocked to learn that Indians are the second largest immigrant group because you don't see them that visibly, and yet they've been very impactful. All right, one of these days I'll get these right. So here are a few takeaways. I'm going to send a few more slides. I think of Washington as a highly globalized city. Obviously, a city very influential because of its position as the capital of the United States, but as a kind of globalization from below, more and more diverse peoples are coming there. And that hyper-diverseness is a range of opportunities. Many people have said that is sort of some of the strength of the new economy, where you really rely on talent and education, and the city is able to get that. Because it's so dispersed, how we understand the new that come sometimes is unclear. And then, for the most part, I would say there are been a lot of successes in integration and inclusion, and some of the inner counties have been very good at reaching out to diverse groups. But whenever there has really been dramatic demographic change, you tend to have the pendulum swing the other way and get some blowback or anti-immigrant feelings. So, because I worked in not just Washington but other cities, a few years ago I was asked by the United Nations to work on a project that was collaborative and involved many, many people to think about how do we make cities more inclusive? What do we think about? Is this important? And what we know is that there's a lot of mobility in the world. There are many places that are as diverse as they could ever be. Washington is an extremely diverse place, but it's not alone. There are other cities like it. How do you make those places work? And many people say, it isn't something that happens at the state level or the federal level. It's really got to happen at the local level. I mean, you need laws and questions of citizenship resolved, but you also have to think about how do you be inclusive. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to skip ahead a couple of slides. And, oh, that's not really good. Can you read that even? Okay. So when we worked on this book project, we thought about different ways of being inclusive. And as a geographer, and I was one of several geographers on the team, we thought about spatial inclusion. It's important to know where people live. And are they clustered or are they dispersed? And what that means. Where are there places of investment, places of recreation? Where do they perceive as safe places or unsafe places? And one of the things we found interesting, having focus groups, we would, in this map, this is a representation of a map, we had a big wall map of metropolitan Washington, and this was a focus group of Bolivians, and we said, where do you think would be the best places to have a business? And interestingly, this is where they selected, and when we compared it to where Bolivians lived, it was almost right on, you know? So they would say this is a group that they think about their ethnic economy as sort of first and foremost in their mind, and they want to have their businesses where their people are. We did the same thing with Ethiopians, and they had a very different map. It wasn't so much where they were, but where they felt the business opportunities were, which were definitely in the urban core. So that perceptual space is also as important as the actual space where people are residing. And then, obviously, political inclusion is very important. And here we're thinking about the obvious things, not just whether you're a citizen or not, we're talking at the local level. Some jurisdictions let people vote on local elections, for example. You know, you can't vote for the president, but you can vote for the school board. Others have immigrant advisory councils, where, especially if you're really refugee, you talk to key members of the community. What are the issues you have, and being mindful of immigrants. thinking about public space and how it's used or not used. These are some of the issues that came up. And then, of course, there are local laws that can be very exclusionary and also more inclusionary. For economic inclusion, some of the things that can happen at the local level, you got to remember, we have a wide range of people that come in. Maybe people don't even understand the first thing about banking, even basic finance training or entrepreneurship. A lot of times, chambers of commerce reach out to immigrant groups. There's sort of loan associations, both formal and informal. So when local towns and communities have to think about what are the things that potentially newcomers might need to know, you have to think about economic inclusion. Institutional inclusion is whether unions that reach out to immigrants or chambers of commerce, minority business associations. And in the case of the U.S., a lot of this structure exists already because of efforts to be outreach to minorities that are native born, but a lot of immigrants can actually benefit from these associations. And then the social and cultural inclusion, this is the photo at the top. One of the keystones we found is how important libraries are. Libraries are often places where they provide materials in multiple languages. Libraries and schools are just critical outreach centers. And also things like paying attention to sports leagues and dance groups and all sorts of things, and religious organizations that become a way of including diverse peoples. And some of these can be intentional, maybe supported by local governments, or they happen through the social networks of migrant groups themselves. So this is the text, Migrants, Inclusion in Cities, and it's trying to be global. It wasn't just the U.S. Attorney of Washington. And one of the interesting things that when we tested this out and went to the governor or mayors, what do you want? And they all asked, we want a checklist. Funny, everyone likes a list. What do you need to do to be more inclusive? And this was through a long discussion with them, but these are some of the things that came up. Some of these, like, do you have migrant outreach, access to public space and those sorts of things, local voting rights, associations and coalitions. And I guess the idea of a checklist, and again, thinking how was a local officials think, at least ask yourself, are you even thinking about this? And if you're thinking about it, are you going to do anything or are you not going to do anything? And anyhow, at least some of the feedback we had, people liked this, at least got them thinking. Some places are very far along. If you're interested in the question of migrant inclusion, one of the places I send people is the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, MOIA, in New York City. Unbelievable resource if you're an immigrant in New York City, and kind of the gold standard. It's multiple languages, all sorts of where you find services, access, training, all one-stop shopping. And it's kind of been so successful that a lot of other cities are emulating, realizing, the idea you have to go to this office and see this thing. Why not? Most people actually know how to use computers, can go to a library and download documents, let the internet work for you, and facilitate some of this through online forums and information. So I am mindful of the time, and I'm going to stop right here. But thank you very much, and I'm happy to take
We've got some questions, and please project loudly so that you can be heard on the video as well as by other people in the audience.
I have one. I'm just trying to, I wanted to pull up your name so I can properly address you again. So,
Marie Price.
Okay, Ms. Price?
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Price, thank you very much for your time. I just had two quick questions about your research. It was really it was widespread. It covered a lot of ground. So two questions were, first, is there any notion on the motivation of some of the immigrants in coming over, whether or not they're coming over seeking, job opportunities, or does Washington, D.C. kind of have that international name recognition? And that's my first question. And my second one is also, with these different groups, has there been just any research in terms of maybe the generational trends of like how income is spread out? Okay.
Good question. Motivation is all over the place, but I would say most of it's through their economic migrants. They're coming because they see more opportunities in Washington. Although there's refugee resettlement, and so in refugee resettlement, you're actually told where you're going to settle. You don't necessarily have to stay there, but that sets up some of the settlement decisions. And then you can't dismiss, there's a whole part of immigration law that emphasizes family, what's the term I'm looking for? Reunification, thank you. And so families, children of migrants, relatives can come and come. So some of it's for family reasons, a lot of economic reasons. But I do think Washington can be an attractive place because it is diverse and in many places can be pretty accommodating. So it has grown and it's still growing as an immigrant destination. What was your second question?
And the second one was just the generational one.
This
third one came in. I don't want to hog the time.
No. Well, that's a really important one. So we've seen, what some people call downward assimilation. So you integrate into the society, but you don't do better socioeconomically. That's certainly a problem in some groups. But again, you also see a lot of upward assimilation. And I think it really depends on the group you're looking at. But generally, in these three case studies that we've done with Indians, Bolivians, and Ethiopians, the adult children of migrants have done as well as, or not better than their parents. It's more
Is there any research into how these immigrant communities interact with each other?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Not a lot. It's hard to do. I mean, you see it, say, in schools or some organizations. There have been some partnerships, collaboration. For example, there's actually a really interesting, in the District of Columbia, there's an Office of African Affairs. So again, why do immigrants come? The interesting story about African migration to Washington, not African American, but African migration, was that, I don't know if you know Howard University, it's a historically black college, it's very important. As the African states were becoming independent in the 60s, it was a top destination for young Africans to go and be trained and to learn, to get an education. And so there's like this particularly, some of the immigrant biography where we realize, Ethiopians came to Washington because of, Howard. And then once you had a few people, more came. And then the District of Columbia has an Office of African Affairs that particularly deals with African immigrants in the city. That is indicative of the important flow. Not all the Africans live in the city, but it's certainly a place where they go to. And so there's an example of an institutional that kind of informally helped to spark some flow and then reacting to that flow by setting up a mechanism to help deal with some of the African issues. Yes.
I had a question about, I grew up in Reston, Virginia, and we moved there in 1969 when I was a kid, and it was a planned community right next to Herndon. And, but it was basically, we were some of the first families that, we were almost like homesteaders. And Tyson's Corner was still farmland when we lived there, and then that grew up and turned into what is now the big locus in Fairfax County of Hispanic. We wanted Salvadoran food. We went out to, in the early 80s when I was in college and stuff, we'd go to El Tamarindo down in Adams Morgan. You get out Ethiopian or Salvadoran because it was still contained there. My question is that, we're right next door to Herndon, which is like the old town, old Virginia. But I always say I grew up in D.C. because I'm not from Virginia, even though I grew up in Northern Virginia, because we really didn't see ourselves as Virginians. And Fairfax County and Reston in particular was brand new. I mean, it had nothing to do with the rest of the state. What happens is that I can't stand going back up there now, even though my mom still lives there, just because the growth, and not immigrant growth, just growth, period, is so huge. So I'm wondering, as a percentage of the total growth of the population of Fairfax County, and Washington metropolitan region, how does the mix of immigrants as a part of that total growth?
They're a really important part of that total growth. They're not the only part of the story.
Well, I guess that's what I'm asking in particular. So what percentage are they, and how does that compare to other metropolitan areas? Because I know we're not the only area that's grown by leaps and bounds, but I have a feeling that Washington D.C. and the Washington metropolitan area has had pretty spectacular growth compared to a lot of other regions.
I can't fully answer, the data is not at the top of it, but certainly it's both. Whereas Los Angeles, metropolitan Los Angeles, it would have lost population between 2000 and 2010 had it not been for immigration. So there's a phenomenon where you have a lot of people leaving Los Angeles, not just the city, but the metropolitan area, for other states, other areas, and then being really infilling with immigrants. Whereas like a Houston or a Dallas, Fort Worth, that's both. You got in-migration from other states and you have international migration.
But I knew very few people growing up, for example, in my school, who were from Virginia. The kids on my...
That's sort of the Reston effect.
That's the Reston effect, right. Yeah.
But no, Herndon is very different, and it actually, it's a complicated story. But both Reston and Herndon have a pretty high foreign born now. It's not the same place that you grew up in.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I am primarily interested in immigrant integration, and I was wondering if you know if integration is more successful depending on what group of immigrants you're working with. So for example, if immigrant integration policies should depend on whether immigrants are refugees or economic migrants, and also if they vary based on the country of origin of immigrants.
Yeah, that's so complicated. I think it's the group. I also think it's where they're settling and what kind of opportunities are there. Are their kids in good schools or crummy schools? Are they getting an education or not? What are their job opportunities? So it's really all over the place. But there is certainly a pretty good amount of evidence with Latinos, and that's the group probably I know the best from my life and doing work in Latin America, that by third generation, maybe that there is very high levels of social integration and even economic integration. So there's always that hard transition, first, second generation. But usually by third generation, you can't tell them apart from native born that have been even longer. So we don't always plan it that well in the United States. In fact, we don't really have a very strong integration policy per se, but a lot of integration has happened, despite ourselves. But a really good site to go to is the Migration Policy Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington. They have a whole group that just looks at the question of integration in the United States. And they have all kinds of reports. And, the story varies a lot. So as a geographer, I'm always saying place matters. And, you can look at national figure, but sometimes it really comes down to the local communities and how they address diversity. Yes, sir.
Yes, excuse me if I sound redundant. I came in through the last 20 minutes. But the question I want to ask is, do you see any evolution in the way that second and third generation Indians deal with politics and change politics, especially since they're U.S. political center? Do you see any evolution from how their parents dealt with politics to the second and third?
So the really interesting thing about South Asian Indians, there aren't many third generations. They haven't been here very long. But there are some second generation, and we have two South Asian governors, right? Jindal and who's the governor in South Carolina?
Haley.
Haley, right. So, they have, there's an example of, at least of integration. Haley, both of them I think were born here in the United States, but their parents were South Asian immigrants. So. But it's that research is still another 10, 20 years out because it's really One of the big flows that's really grown, most of the South Asian Indians have only been here, say, 15, 20 years, so you don't have a third generation. You barely have a second generation.
Hi, I'm from Silver Spring, so I'm particularly interested.
You know Wheaton then.
If you found that there are certain counties that are more accommodating to immigrants than others, who are helpful in general.
I think Fairfax and Montgomery County have done a tremendous job. They have a very diverse population. But I would say every place I've looked at, there's sort of the continuum, that areas that can be very accommodating and less so, and it varies. But in general, Maryland has been more accommodating than Virginia at the state level. And within the counties I've looked at in Washington, I think Montgomery County has been much more. The key is when you have a sudden demographic change like this, and incredible diversity, you can't assume that everyone's going to figure out how to get along. And it really calls for local officials to be proactive, to think about what are the problems and issues they might have. And if you don't think about it, you can have blow-ups, or you can have politicians exploiting the potential for bigotry and racism, and to blame an immigrant group, you're the bad guys, or you're the good, So even though it's not something that we've ever codified at the national level, how do you integrate? Locally, I think a lot of local governments know you have to develop some policies and outreach. And the places that do usually avoid blow-ups, but not always. Yes?
So, kind of sort of going along with that, in your opinion, what is the, how important is it that kind of these first generation and second generation immigrants assimilate culturally? Like, because of federalism, because many of them are concentrated in areas where there are lots of immigrants, and they can connect through these different they can connect through, like you said, like places of worship, or like clubs, or like libraries, or school, or even now we have the internet. So I guess my question is it really necessary? Is cultural assimilation necessarily something that should be required in order to successfully function? Because I know people who easily can, they identify with the culture of their native land, and they're still able to kind of do what they need to do.
Well, identity can be nested, right? You can have at home your identity as an Ethiopian, and then your American identity, and I think especially children of immigrant families do that pretty well. And the question on language, kind of the bottom level measure of cultural assimilation, do you speak English? And most of the other show people do learn English. Maybe not the first generation, certainly the second generation. Schools are a really powerful integrating tool. I'm always amazed, teenagers in high school, no matter what their race, creed, religion, they all kind of look alike. They kind of mind what's the fashion, what's the cool music to listen to. There's that. That's an incredible melting pot. But for older people who come, it's a lot harder. Especially people that come without the language skills, and so there are certainly challenges. But it is a very new world. This kind of hyperdiversity. And I think many places really struggle with it. Some of the work I've done in Washington is trying to show areas where there's been successes and what we can learn. But at last I have to stop. I'm getting the high sign from Mary.
Thank you.